My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We're in the midst of a study of 1 Corinthians 15 and the resurrection. And we've been focused for the last little bit on Paul's modus ponens, Paul's logical form of argument against the scoffers at 1 Corinthians, or in Corinth. The scoffers who were denying that, quote, the dead ones, unquote, were going to receive resurrection life. I've shared with you that a careful examination of Paul's argument proves that he was not dealing with people who were denying, quote, resurrection, unquote. This is proven by the fact they accepted Jesus' resurrection. It is proven by the fact they believed in, if you please, the resurrection of Christians who had died, obviously, since Christ had died and been rose again. Well, look, you can't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, and you cannot believe in the resurrection of Christians without affirming resurrection, right? I mean, it's just not possible. So when people say, and by the way, some objectors keep saying, no, the scoffers were denying resurrection. Well, then they were denying the resurrection of Jesus, and they were denying the resurrection of Christians. But that's patently not the case. 99.9% of commentators come to 1 Corinthians 15, and they claim that the scoffers were denying resurrection to anyone. But folks, it's critical to see that is not the case. If they were not denying resurrection life to Christians, they were not denying resurrection. When we examine and when we carefully note what it was that Paul is saying, what Paul is arguing, the form of his argumentation, when we examine the Greek tenses, as I've shared with you, it becomes more than obvious that there was a given group, a specific group, that the scoffers were denying resurrection life for. And again, it wasn't Christians. Now, it helps us to focus at this point, to understand this, to ask a question related to what we said at the very beginning of our study. If we lose sight of the fact that Paul's discussion of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 is about the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, if we lose sight of that fact, we are going to probably, almost certainly, misunderstand what it was and who it was Paul is arguing with and what he's arguing about. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is discussing the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 12, the resurrection of the just and the unjust to everlasting life for the resurrection of the just. He is discussing the fulfillment of Isaiah 25, 6 to 8. The promise to Israel to restore her, to resurrect her out of covenantal death. It is Paul's discussion of Hosea chapter 13 to destroy death. Well, what kind of death is in Hosea? The kind of death in Hosea is described in verse 1 and 2, in which when Israel sinned, she died, and yet she kept sinning. That's not biological death. But of course, the point of it is, here is Paul, and by the way, he's obviously drawing from Ezekiel 37 as well, and you can't get physical resurrection out of Ezekiel 37 without doing grave injustice to the text. But again, the whole point here is, Paul is drawing from Old Covenant Israel's promises. Those promises were focused on, like a laser, on Israel. And as has been noted, unless and until Israel received her promises, the nations could not receive their blessings. The blessings to the Gentiles would flow from Israel. Romans 15:16. Salvation is of the Jews. John 4:20. So it is absolutely critical as we examine, okay, who are these dead ones? Well, the dead ones of necessity are the recipients of the promises made to Israel. The promises found in Ezekiel and Daniel and Isaiah and Hosea. To separate those promises and to say, well, okay, yes, those promises were made to Israel, but Israel failed somehow, and now they've been given to the church. That is a horrific replacement theology. It is totally unbiblical. Those promises were made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, and God's promises to Israel after the flesh, were irrevocable. Romans 11:28 and following. Thus, God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, the resurrection promise of 1 Corinthians 15, which is involved with the dead ones, those promises had to be fulfilled for anyone else to receive life. And thus Paul could say, notice what Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15:19, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. If the dead ones are not raised, if Israel does not receive her resurrection promise, then no one has any promise of life. Folks, you've got to catch the power of the fact that Paul is focused on Israel. Anytime and every time Paul discusses resurrection, he says, for the hope of the promise of the resurrection am I on trial this day. For the hope of the promise of the 12 tribes am I on trial this day. Paul never divorces his resurrection doctrine from the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. If we fail to honor this fact in Paul's discussion of the resurrection life for the dead ones, and we then extrapolate that out to a generic, timeless reference to, quote, the dead, we have misapplied Paul's teaching. And I'll show you that even more on the flip side. Hey, in the meantime, do not forget, you need a copy of this book, Exegetical Essays on the Resurrection by Sam Frost. Go to my website, BibleProphecy.com. You'll enjoy this book. And we will see you on the flip side.